Have you ever noticed how quickly you reach for your phone the moment you are left alone? How silence feels heavier than noise, how an empty room can suddenly feel overwhelming, how your mind becomes restless the moment there is no one to distract you. Most people are not afraid of being alone. They are afraid of meeting themselves without escape. The Buddha taught that suffering does not come from isolation itself, but from our resistance to facing our own mind. What if the loneliness you are running from is not your enemy, but your initiation? What if the pain of solitude is not a sign that something is wrong, but a sign that something deep inside you is trying to awaken? Today, you are going to see why the space you fear most is the space where your spiritual power is born. 1. The pain of aloneness exposes the illusion of dependency. When you are always around people, it is easy to believe that you are emotionally strong and independent. Conversations, laughter, and constant interaction make you feel stable. But often, that stability is quietly supported by others. Their attention makes you feel important. Their messages make you feel remembered. Their approval makes you feel worthy. You may not even realize how much your mood depends on them. When you are alone, all of that disappears. There are no distractions, no reassurance, no validation, and suddenly you may feel restless or empty. This feeling hurts because it shows you something you did not want to see. You begin to understand how much of your happiness was connected to other people's actions. If someone ignored you, it affected you deeply. If someone praised you, it lifted your confidence. Your emotional state was tied to them. The Buddha taught that attachment is the root of suffering. Attachment is not just loving someone, it is believing that you cannot feel whole without them. Solitude exposes this belief. It reveals the invisible chains that were controlling your peace. At first, this clarity feels painful because it breaks the illusion that you were fully independent. But this awareness is not a curse. It is the beginning of freedom. When you finally see your dependencies clearly, you gain the power to grow beyond them. 2. Silence forces you to meet your real mind. When you are constantly busy, your mind stays distracted. You scroll, you talk, you watch, you listen, and the noise keeps you from noticing what is happening inside you. But when you are alone and everything becomes quiet, there is nowhere to hide. The silence begins to feel loud. Thoughts you avoided start to appear. Old memories resurface. Fears and insecurities come to the surface. This is why many people feel uncomfortable in silence. It is not the silence itself that hurts. It is what the silence reveals. You begin to see how much overthinking controls you. You notice how often you replay past mistakes or imagine worst-case scenarios. Without distraction, your real mental patterns become clear. The Buddha taught that awareness is the path to freedom. He did not run from his thoughts, he observed them. When you sit alone and face your mind honestly, you are doing the same. At first, it feels uncomfortable because you are seeing the chaos directly. But slowly, as you observe without reacting, your mind begins to calm. Silence stops being your enemy. It becomes your teacher, and through that awareness, healing begins. 3. Solitude strengthens emotional self-sufficiency. When you are used to sharing your feelings with others all the time, you slowly become dependent on their reactions. When you feel sad, you look for someone to comfort you. When you feel confused, you look for someone to guide you. When you feel insecure, you look for reassurance. There is nothing wrong with support, but when you cannot regulate your emotions without someone else stepping in, your peace becomes fragile. It depends on availability. It depends on responses. It depends on who stays and who leaves. Solitude changes this dynamic. When you are alone, there is no one immediately there to calm you down or lift your mood. At first, this feels heavy. You may feel emotionally exposed, as if you have lost your safety net. But slowly, something powerful begins to happen. You start learning how to sit with your own emotions. Instead of escaping sadness, you observe it. Instead of panicking in uncertainty, you breathe through it. Instead of begging for reassurance, you speak kindly to yourself. The Buddha taught that true peace does not come from outside conditions, it comes from mastering the mind. Solitude trains you in this mastery. You begin to understand that emotions rise and fall like waves. They are temporary. They do not need immediate fixing. The more you sit with them calmly, the more stable you become. Over time, you notice a shift. Rejection does not shake you as deeply. Silence from others does not disturb you as much. You stop reacting impulsively just to feel connected. You become emotionally self-sufficient. And when you reach that point, relationships no longer control your happiness. You choose them from strength, not from need. 4. Being alone removes external masks. When you are constantly around other people, you rarely get the chance to see who you truly are. Without even realizing it, you adjust yourself to fit the environment. You change your tone depending on who you are speaking to. You soften your opinions so you do not offend. You exaggerate parts of your personality so you are more liked. You hide your insecurities. You pretend to be stronger, happier, calmer, or more confident than you actually feel. Over time, this performance becomes automatic. You no longer even notice that you are wearing a mask. You begin to confuse the role you play with your real identity. Human beings are deeply influenced by social approval. From childhood, you were rewarded for certain behaviors and criticized for others. Slowly, you learned which version of yourself received acceptance and which version received rejection. So you shaped yourself to survive socially. You built an identity that would be easier for others to accept. But that identity is often incomplete. It is polished, filtered, and adjusted to avoid discomfort. When you are alone, that performance loses its purpose. There is no audience, no one to impress, no one to compete with, no expectations to meet. At first, this feels uncomfortable because you are left without the role that once defined you. You may feel unsure of yourself. You may feel strange, almost empty, because you are not actively being someone for others. But this discomfort is not a sign of weakness. It is the beginning of authenticity. The Buddha taught that much of what we call self is constructed by conditioning. Your likes, dislikes, fears, ambitions, and even your personality traits are shaped by experiences and social influence. When you are constantly surrounded by people, this conditioning stays active. But in solitude, the external pressure fades. You begin to see which parts of you are genuine and which parts were created for approval. You may notice that some goals you were chasing were not truly yours. You may realize that certain behaviors were driven by fear of rejection rather than inner truth. You may even discover that some relationships were maintained not out of love, but out of fear of being alone. These realizations can feel unsettling because they shake your sense of identity, but they are also freeing. Solitude gives you the space to rebuild yourself consciously. Without constant comparison, you stop measuring your worth against others. Without constant feedback, you stop shaping yourself for applause. You begin asking deeper questions. What do I truly value? What brings me peace when no one is watching? Who am I when I am not trying to be liked? These questions cannot be answered in a crowd. They require stillness. As you spend more time alone, your self-image becomes clearer and more stable. You no longer feel the need to constantly prove yourself. You stop pretending to be something you are not. Your actions become aligned with your inner values rather than social pressure. This alignment creates a powerful form of peace. It is the peace that comes from living honestly. Being alone removes the mask, and removing the mask can feel vulnerable. But it is only when the mask falls that you can breathe freely. Solitude strips away the false layers and brings you closer to your true nature. And in Buddhism, returning to your true nature is not loss, it is awakening. 5. Solitude breaks the addiction to external validation. One of the most powerful attachments we carry is not to people themselves, but to their approval. Many do not realize that they are not just attached to relationships, but to the feeling of being seen, praised, and acknowledged. From a young age, you were rewarded when you performed well, when you behaved properly, when you impressed others. Slowly, your mind learned to associate approval with safety and worth. Over time, this conditioning became so deep that you began to measure your value through the reactions of others. In the modern world, this addiction has only become stronger. Social media amplifies it. Every like, comment, or message becomes a small dose of validation. When you receive attention, you feel uplifted. When you are ignored, you feel diminished. Your mood rises and falls based on how others respond to you. Even your decisions may begin to revolve around how they will be perceived. You dress in ways that attract praise. You speak in ways that gain agreement. You share achievements so they can be acknowledged. None of this may seem harmful on the surface, but slowly, your inner stability becomes dependent on external feedback. When you enter solitude, this supply of validation weakens. There is no audience applauding your progress, no one constantly reminding you that you matter. At first, this feels uncomfortable, almost like emotional withdrawal. You may feel unnoticed, unimportant, or invisible. The ego reacts strongly because it has been fed for so long by external recognition. Without that stimulation, it begins to panic. But this discomfort is not destruction, it is detoxification. Just as the body reacts when it withdraws from something it depended on, the mind reacts when it is separated from validation. In this space, you are forced to confront an important question: who am I without praise? If no one congratulates me, am I still proud of my effort? If no one notices my growth, does it still matter? These questions reveal the depth of your inner dependence. The Buddha taught about the 8 worldly winds: praise and blame, gain and loss, pleasure and pain, fame and disrepute. Most people are constantly blown around by these winds. When praised, they feel high. When criticized, they feel crushed. Their peace is unstable because it is tied to forces they cannot control. Solitude trains you to step out of this storm. When you spend time alone, you slowly learn to act without seeking applause. You improve quietly. You reflect honestly. You make changes not because they will be admired, but because they align with your inner values. As this shift happens, something powerful grows inside you. You begin to experience self-validation. You learn to appreciate your own effort. You learn to respect yourself even when no one else is watching. Your actions become rooted in sincerity rather than performance. This creates a deeper kind of confidence, one that does not collapse when criticized and does not inflate when praised. Over time, you notice that the opinions of others lose their emotional grip. Compliments no longer control you, and insults no longer define you. You are no longer chasing approval or fearing judgment. You move through life with quiet strength. Relationships become healthier because you are not using them to fill a void of validation. You connect out of choice, not need. Solitude breaks the addiction to external validation by showing you that your worth was never dependent on applause. It teaches you that value does not come from being seen, but from being aligned with your true self. And when you reach that understanding, you are no longer easily manipulated by praise or criticism. You become internally stable, and internal stability is spiritual power. 6. Alone time deepens awareness and spiritual insight. Most people move through life on autopilot. They wake up, follow routines, respond to messages, complete tasks, talk, listen, react, and sleep. Days pass, then months, then years, and very little deep reflection ever happens. The mind remains busy, but not aware. It is active, but not conscious. When you are constantly surrounded by people, responsibilities, and noise, there is no real space to observe yourself. You are always reacting to something outside of you. Solitude interrupts this automatic way of living. When you are alone, the pace of your life naturally slows down. There are fewer interruptions, fewer demands, fewer conversations pulling your attention outward. In that quiet space, something subtle begins to happen. Your awareness sharpens. You start noticing things you previously ignored. You notice your breathing. You notice how your thoughts move from one topic to another. You notice how certain memories trigger emotions. You notice how your body responds to stress. This simple noticing is powerful. In Buddhism, awareness is the foundation of transformation. The Buddha did not gain enlightenment through noise or distraction. He sat in stillness and observed reality as it was. When you spend time alone, you create a similar environment for insight to arise. You begin to see clearly how your mind works. You see how desires create tension. You see how expectations create disappointment. You see how clinging to outcomes creates anxiety. These realizations do not come from reading or listening alone. They come from direct observation. Solitude also gives you space to question your patterns. Why do I react strongly to certain situations? Why do I seek control? Why do I fear uncertainty? Without constant social interaction, you can trace these reactions back to their roots. You may discover that many of your fears are based on past experiences that no longer define your present. You may realize that much of your stress comes from imagined scenarios rather than real threats. This clarity weakens the power those thoughts once had over you. As awareness deepens, emotional reactions begin to soften. Instead of immediately reacting with anger, you pause. Instead of being overwhelmed by sadness, you observe it as a passing state. Instead of chasing every desire, you question whether it truly brings peace. This shift creates inner space between stimulus and response, and in that space, wisdom grows. Over time, solitude becomes less about being physically alone and more about being mentally present. Even when you return to the world and interact with others, the awareness you developed remains with you. You respond more calmly, you speak more consciously, you act with greater intention. The insight gained in silence begins to shape your everyday life. Being alone hurts at first because it removes distraction. It forces you to sit with thoughts and emotions you once avoided. But as you continue, that same space becomes a source of clarity. You begin to understand yourself at a deeper level, and through that understanding, you stop fighting reality, you stop resisting what is. You begin to move with life rather than against it. Solitude does not isolate you from truth, it brings you closer to it. And in Buddhism, seeing clearly is the beginning of freedom. 7. Solitude teaches you that you were always whole. From the very beginning of your life, you were taught directly or indirectly that you needed someone in order to feel complete. You were shown images of love, partnership, friendship, community, and approval as the ultimate sources of happiness. Movies, stories, and even everyday conversations reinforced the same idea, that fulfillment comes from finding someone who completes you. Slowly, without even questioning it, you absorbed this belief. You began to measure your worth by how many people stood beside you. You began to fear being alone, not because solitude was harmful, but because you believed it meant you were lacking. This belief is subtle but powerful. It hides beneath your decisions, your attachments, and your anxieties. When someone leaves your life, you may feel as if a part of you has been taken away. When you are not chosen, you may interpret it as proof that you are not enough. When you sit alone in silence, you may feel an emptiness that seems unbearable. But what if that emptiness is not a sign of incompleteness? What if it is simply the unfamiliar feeling of meeting yourself without distraction? Solitude confronts this illusion directly. When you are alone for long enough, you are forced to face the idea that there is no one there to complete you. At first, this can feel frightening. The mind searches for connection. It looks for reassurance. It reaches outward. But when you remain in that space instead of escaping it, something profound begins to unfold. You start to realize that nothing essential is missing. You are still breathing. You are still thinking. You are still capable of feeling, learning, growing. Your existence does not collapse simply because no one is present. The Buddha taught that suffering arises from attachment and ignorance of your true nature. You suffer when you believe that your wholeness depends on external conditions. You suffer when you believe that your identity is defined by your relationships. But in solitude, those external definitions fade. There are no roles to perform. You are not someone's partner, someone's friend, someone's child, someone's colleague. You are simply you, and in that simplicity, you begin to rediscover your original state. At first, you may resist this discovery. The ego prefers identity built through comparison. It prefers being seen and labeled. Without these labels, it feels uncertain. But beyond the ego, there is something steady and quiet. There is a deeper awareness that does not depend on validation. When you sit alone long enough, you begin to feel this presence. It is calm. It is stable. It does not panic in silence. It does not crave applause. It simply exists. This realization changes everything. You begin to see that the loneliness you feared was not caused by solitude itself, but by resistance to it. You were not suffering because you were alone. You were suffering because you believed being alone meant being incomplete. Once that belief starts to dissolve, solitude transforms. It stops feeling like abandonment and starts feeling like space. It becomes an opportunity to strengthen your relationship with yourself. As you spend more time alone, you start appreciating your own company. You begin to enjoy your own thoughts. You learn to sit with your emotions without judgment. Instead of feeling empty, you begin to feel spacious. Instead of feeling rejected, you begin to feel independent. The fear that once controlled you loses its grip. You realize that your worth was never determined by who stayed or who left. It was always inherent. This does not mean you stop valuing relationships. Buddhism does not teach isolation from the world. It teaches non-attachment. When you understand that you are already whole, you approach relationships differently. You no longer cling. You no longer beg to be chosen. You no longer tolerate disrespect out of fear of being alone. You connect from abundance, not from deficiency. You share your life with others, not because you need them to survive emotionally, but because you choose to share your wholeness. Solitude also teaches you resilience. When you know you can stand alone peacefully, you are no longer easily manipulated by fear of abandonment. You are not easily controlled by threats of rejection. You move through life with quiet confidence because you have already faced the silence and survived it. You have already met yourself and discovered that you are enough. Over time, you may even begin to treasure solitude, not as an escape, but as a return. It becomes the place where you reset your mind, where you reflect deeply, where you reconnect with your inner stillness. It becomes sacred space. In that space, you remember that you are not defined by social status, romantic success, or external approval. You are defined by your awareness, your presence, your capacity for growth. The journey from loneliness to wholeness is not instant. It requires patience. It requires honesty. There will be moments when the old fear resurfaces, when you doubt your strength. But each time you sit with yourself instead of running, you reinforce a new truth. You remind yourself that you are not broken, you are not lacking, you are not incomplete. You are simply human, learning to recognize your inherent completeness. Alone hurts at first, because it strips away distractions and illusions. It exposes the belief that you needed someone else to validate your existence. But as you remain in solitude with awareness, that belief begins to fade. What remains is a deeper understanding. You were never missing anything. You were never half of something waiting to be completed. You were always whole. And when you truly understand this, solitude no longer feels like a wound. It feels like healing. It feels like freedom. It feels like awakening. 8. Solitude transforms suffering into strength. There is a moment in deep solitude when you realize that the pain you once feared is not destroying you, it is reshaping you. When you are first left alone, whether by circumstance, rejection, distance, or personal choice, the silence can feel heavy. The absence of voices, the lack of shared energy, the empty space around you can create a sharp awareness of your own vulnerability. You may feel exposed, unsupported, uncertain. The mind begins to replay memories. It begins to question your worth. It begins to imagine worst-case futures. In these early stages, solitude feels like suffering. But something important is happening beneath that discomfort. Without distractions, your emotional wounds rise to the surface. The grief you ignored, the rejection you minimized, the fear you buried under busyness. When you were constantly surrounded by people, you could avoid looking directly at these wounds. You could numb them with conversation, entertainment, or new attachments. Solitude removes those coverings. It forces you to see clearly what still hurts. At first, this feels overwhelming. You may think you are becoming weaker because you feel more sensitive. You may believe that being alone is making you fragile. But in truth, the opposite is happening. You are finally allowing yourself to process what was left unresolved. In Buddhism, suffering is not something to escape from blindly, it is something to understand. The Buddha did not deny pain. He examined it deeply. He observed its causes and its nature. Only through understanding did liberation arise. When you remain in solitude long enough, you begin to observe your suffering instead of being consumed by it. You notice how certain thoughts trigger emotional reactions. You see how clinging to the past creates regret. You see how fearing the future creates anxiety. Slowly, awareness creates distance. The pain is still there, but you are no longer drowning in it. You are studying it, and that shift from reacting to observing is the beginning of strength. Solitude teaches emotional endurance. When there is no one immediately there to soothe you, you learn to sit with discomfort. You learn that intense emotions rise, peak, and fall. You discover that sadness does not last forever, that loneliness changes shape, that fear weakens when faced directly. Each time you survive a wave of emotion without escaping it, you grow stronger. You begin to trust your own resilience. Over time, you notice that the same situations that once shattered you now feel manageable. Rejection does not define you. Criticism does not crush you. Silence from others does not make you panic. Why? Because you have already endured deeper silence. You have already faced your inner fears. You have already proven to yourself that you can stand alone without collapsing. That experience builds unshakable confidence, not loud confidence that seeks attention, but quiet confidence rooted in lived truth. Solitude also reshapes your relationship with pain itself. Instead of viewing pain as an enemy, you begin to see it as a teacher. Every uncomfortable emotion becomes information. It reveals where you are attached. It reveals what you are afraid of losing. It reveals where you still seek validation. In this way, suffering becomes guidance. It shows you where growth is needed. Without solitude, these lessons would remain hidden under distraction. As this transformation continues, you may begin to notice something surprising. The same solitude that once felt suffocating now feels empowering. You begin to value your independence. You begin to appreciate your ability to navigate life without constant reassurance. You become less reactive, more grounded. Your decisions are no longer driven by fear of abandonment or desire for approval. They are guided by clarity and self-respect. This does not mean you stop feeling emotions. It means emotions no longer control you. You can feel sadness without losing your sense of worth. You can experience disappointment without questioning your identity. You can walk away from situations that no longer serve you without feeling incomplete. Solitude has strengthened your inner foundation. The Buddha taught that true strength comes from mastering the mind. External circumstances will always change. People will come and go. Praise will turn into criticism. Gain will turn into loss. If your stability depends on these shifting conditions, your peace will always be fragile. But when solitude teaches you how to anchor yourself internally, you become steady. You are no longer pushed around by the changing winds of life. There is also a deeper spiritual shift that occurs in prolonged solitude. You begin to recognize that much of your suffering was created by resistance. Resistance to being alone, resistance to uncertainty, resistance to discomfort. When you stop resisting and simply allow yourself to be, the suffering softens. You realize that aloneness itself is neutral. It is your interpretation of it that created pain. When the interpretation changes, the experience changes. Eventually, you reach a point where solitude no longer feels like exile. It feels like training. It feels like preparation. It feels like a sacred period of strengthening. You see clearly that without this phase, you would still be dependent, reactive, and easily shaken. Solitude has refined you. It has stripped away illusions. It has forced you to confront yourself honestly, and through that confrontation, you have grown. Alone hurts at first because it removes comfort, but it heals because it builds capacity. It increases your emotional endurance. It deepens your awareness. It strengthens your self-trust. It transforms your relationship with suffering. What once felt like abandonment becomes empowerment. What once felt like weakness becomes wisdom. In the end, solitude does not isolate you from the world. It prepares you to return to it stronger. You engage with others not out of desperation, but out of choice. You love without clinging. You connect without losing yourself. You walk away without fear. The suffering you endured alone has become strength within you. And that is the spiritual advantage of solitude. It does not protect you from pain. It teaches you how to transform pain into power. 9. Solitude reconnects you with your true nature beyond the ego. When you are constantly surrounded by people, expectations, and responsibilities, your identity becomes tightly connected to roles. You are someone's friend, someone's partner, someone's child, someone's colleague. Each role carries expectations. Each role shapes how you behave. Over time, you begin to believe that these roles are who you truly are. You start defining yourself by how useful you are, how admired you are, how needed you are. Without realizing it, your sense of self becomes entangled with how others perceive you. This is where the ego quietly grows. The ego is not just arrogance. It is the constructed identity you protect and defend. It is the image of yourself that wants approval, fears criticism, seeks importance, and avoids rejection. In social environments, the ego is constantly activated. You compare yourself. You compete. You try to maintain status. You worry about how you are being seen. Even small interactions can trigger insecurity or pride. The ego thrives in constant interaction because it feeds on comparison and reaction. Solitude interrupts this cycle. When you are alone for extended periods, the social mirrors disappear. There is no one reflecting an image back to you. There is no feedback reinforcing who you think you are. At first, this can feel destabilizing. If you are not being praised, who are you? If no one is criticizing you, who are you? If no one is watching you, who are you? These questions may feel uncomfortable because much of your identity was built around external reflection. In Buddhism, the concept of non-self teaches that what we call the self is not fixed or solid. It is a collection of habits, thoughts, memories, and reactions constantly changing. Solitude allows you to witness this directly. When you sit quietly, you begin to notice that your thoughts arise and pass. Your emotions shift, your moods change. The identity you defend so fiercely in public becomes less solid when observed in silence. You may notice how quickly the mind creates stories about itself. One moment you think, I am strong. The next moment you think, I am weak. One day you feel confident. The next day you feel insecure. Which one is the real you? In solitude, you start to see that these labels are temporary mental formations. They are not your true nature. They are passing states. As you continue observing, something deeper becomes noticeable. Beneath the changing thoughts and emotions, there is awareness itself. There is a quiet presence that watches without judgment. This awareness does not need validation. It does not panic when alone. It simply observes. The more time you spend in solitude, the more familiar you become with this deeper layer of yourself. This recognition is powerful. It shifts your identity from being the thoughts to being the observer of thoughts. Instead of saying, I am lonely, you begin to see loneliness is being experienced. Instead of saying, I am rejected, you see, the mind is reacting to rejection. This subtle shift reduces suffering. You are no longer completely identified with every emotional wave. You gain space between who you are and what you feel. Solitude also weakens the ego's need for constant stimulation. Without comparison, pride softens. Without competition, envy fades. Without constant social positioning, the pressure to maintain an image relaxes. You begin to feel lighter because you are not constantly performing. You are not trying to win invisible battles for approval. You are simply being. Over time, this reconnection with your true nature creates deep peace. You realize that your existence is not dependent on roles. You are not only valuable when needed, you are not only important when praised. You are not only worthy when chosen. Your worth is not something granted by others. It is inherent in your awareness, your presence, your capacity to grow and understand. When you return to social life after experiencing this depth of solitude, your relationships change. You no longer cling to identities so tightly. If someone misunderstands you, it does not shake your foundation. If someone criticizes your role, it does not destroy your sense of self. You understand that roles are temporary expressions, not your essence. This also makes you more compassionate. When you see that your own identity is fluid and conditioned, you begin to see the same in others. You realize that much of people's behavior comes from their own fears, attachments, and ego protection. Instead of reacting with anger, you respond with understanding. Solitude has given you insight into the human condition. The spiritual advantage here is profound. Most people spend their entire lives defending an identity that is unstable. They fight to protect reputation. They fear losing status. They chase recognition to reinforce who they believe they are. But when you have sat alone and watched your identity dissolve and reform repeatedly, You stop clinging so tightly. You become flexible. You become adaptable. You become free. Alone hurts at first because it strips away the social identity you relied on. It removes the mirrors that reflected back who you thought you were. But as you remain in solitude, you discover something deeper than image. You discover awareness. You discover presence. You discover that beyond ego, beyond labels, beyond roles, there is a steady inner core that does not depend on anyone's opinion. This is not isolation from the world. It is clarity within it. When you know who you are beyond ego, you can participate in life without losing yourself. You can play roles without becoming trapped in them. You can love without attaching your identity to being loved. You can succeed without believing success defines you. Solitude reconnects you with this deeper truth. It reveals that beneath all conditioning, beneath all expectations, beneath all social masks, there is simple being, and that being is enough. That is the final transformation of solitude. It takes you from dependency, through discomfort, into strength, and finally into self-realization. What once felt like emptiness becomes fullness. What once felt like abandonment becomes awakening. What once felt like isolation becomes insight. Alone hurts until it reveals who you truly are. 10. Solitude makes you spiritually unshakable. There is a level of strength that cannot be developed in comfort. There is a depth of stability that cannot be built in constant companionship. As long as you always have someone to lean on emotionally, as long as there is always noise to distract you, as long as there is always reassurance available, a part of you remains untested. You may appear strong, but your strength has not yet been challenged by true inner silence. Solitude is that test. And if you endure it consciously, it becomes the training ground that makes you spiritually unshakable. When you first experience deep aloneness, it can feel like standing without support. The mind searches for something to hold on to. It wants distraction. It wants validation. It wants certainty. Without these, fear arises. What if I am forgotten? What if I am not enough? What if I end up alone forever? These thoughts can feel overwhelming because they attack the very foundation of your emotional security. But instead of collapsing under these fears, solitude gives you the opportunity to confront them directly. In Buddhism, fear is not something to suppress blindly, it is something to observe. When you sit alone and allow fear to surface without running, you begin to see its true nature. Fear is a projection of the mind. It is built from imagination, memory, and attachment. It feels powerful, but when watched carefully, it loses its solidity. The more you observe it without reacting, the weaker it becomes. Each time you survive a wave of fear in silence, you become stronger. This process builds inner resilience. Resilience is not the absence of emotion. It is the ability to experience emotion without being controlled by it. Solitude trains this ability relentlessly. There is no one there to immediately calm you down. No one there to distract you from uncomfortable truths. You are left with yourself. And at first, that can feel like punishment. But gradually, you begin to trust yourself. You realize that even when discomfort arises, you can handle it. Even when loneliness appears, you can endure it. Even when doubt whispers, you can remain steady. Over time, something shifts in your nervous system. What once triggered panic now triggers reflection. What once created desperation now creates patience. You stop reacting impulsively just to escape discomfort. You stop chasing people just to avoid silence. You stop making decisions out of fear of being alone. Instead, you respond from clarity. You choose from strength. You move from awareness. This is the beginning of being spiritually unshakable. It does not mean that life stops challenging you. It means challenges no longer destabilize your core. When someone leaves your life, you feel sadness, but you do not lose yourself. When plans fail, you feel disappointment, but you do not collapse into hopelessness. When others misunderstand you, you feel the sting, but your identity remains intact. Why? Because you have already faced the deeper fear of standing alone. Solitude also teaches impermanence in a direct way. When you sit alone, you observe how thoughts change, how emotions rise and fall, how even loneliness itself shifts in intensity. Nothing stays the same. This realization is powerful. If loneliness is temporary, then it is not your permanent identity. If sadness passes, then it does not define you. The more you witness impermanence in your own experience, the less you cling to any state. And when you stop clinging, you stop suffering unnecessarily. There is also a spiritual maturity that develops in solitude. You begin to accept reality more easily. You stop fighting the fact that life includes separation, change, and uncertainty. Instead of demanding constant companionship, you learn to appreciate connection when it comes and release it when it goes. This acceptance makes you calm, it makes you grounded, it makes you less reactive. Being spiritually unshakable does not mean becoming cold or detached from humanity. It means becoming anchored. It means that your peace is not easily stolen. It means that your sense of worth does not fluctuate with every external event. It means that you have built a relationship with yourself so strong that external instability cannot break it. The Buddha's strength did not come from controlling the world, it came from mastering the mind. Solitude is the space where this mastery begins. In the silence, you learn patience. In the emptiness, you learn fullness. In the discomfort, you learn endurance. Every moment you remain present, instead of escaping, builds inner muscle. Just as physical strength grows through resistance, spiritual strength grows through conscious solitude. Eventually, you reach a point where being alone no longer feels threatening, it feels empowering. You know that if circumstances force you into isolation, you will not collapse. If relationships end, you will not lose your identity. If approval disappears, your worth will not disappear with it. You become stable in a way that cannot be easily shaken by life's unpredictable changes. This stability radiates outward. People sense it. You no longer chase attention. You no longer beg for connection. You no longer compromise your values just to avoid being alone. Your presence becomes calm and self-contained. You choose relationships from strength, not from fear. You walk away when necessary without losing your inner balance. Alone hurts at first because it strips away comfort and forces you to confront your fears. But if you stay long enough, it builds something extraordinary within you. It builds resilience. It builds clarity. It builds acceptance. It builds self-trust. It builds spiritual stability. And once you become spiritually unshakable, solitude is no longer something you fear. It becomes something you respect. It becomes proof that your strength does not depend on constant support. It becomes evidence that your peace is internal. In the end, solitude does not isolate you from life. It prepares you to face life without trembling. It transforms fear into courage, dependency into independence, and instability into grounded presence. Alone hurts until it forges you into someone who cannot be easily broken. 11. Solitude teaches you to love without losing yourself. One of the greatest spiritual advantages of solitude is something most people never expect. They think being alone is about independence, strength, or detachment. But at a deeper level, solitude teaches you how to love properly. It teaches you how to connect without clinging. It teaches you how to care without collapsing. It teaches you how to give without losing your center. And this lesson cannot be learned in constant emotional dependency. It can only be learned when you have first stood alone and discovered that you are already whole. Many people confuse attachment with love. They believe that intense need, constant reassurance, and emotional dependence are signs of deep connection. But often, what they call love is actually fear. Fear of being abandoned, fear of not being chosen, fear of facing themselves alone. When you have not learned to sit peacefully with yourself, relationships become survival tools. You hold tightly because you believe you will fall without the other person. You tolerate behavior that hurts you because the alternative feels worse. You silence your needs because you fear being left. Solitude breaks this pattern. When you are alone long enough, you are forced to build emotional stability within yourself. You learn to comfort yourself. You learn to regulate your emotions. You learn to sit with loneliness without panicking. Slowly, you realize that you can survive without constant validation. This realization is not cold or distant. It is empowering. It means that when you choose to love someone, you are not doing it from desperation. You are doing it from fullness. In Buddhism, attachment is seen as a source of suffering because it comes from craving and fear. True compassion, however, comes from understanding and presence. Solitude allows you to see the difference. When you observe your own loneliness without reacting, you begin to understand the human condition more deeply. You see how much of your pain came from expecting others to fill a void inside you. And once you recognize that void as something you can hold yourself, your relationships change. You stop expecting someone else to complete you. You stop placing the burden of your happiness on another person's shoulders. You stop demanding constant reassurance. Instead, you bring stability into the connection. You offer love without pressure. You listen without trying to control. You support without clinging. This shift creates healthier bonds. When you no longer fear being alone, you do not stay in relationships that diminish you. You do not chase people who treat you as optional. You do not sacrifice your values just to avoid silence. Solitude has taught you that being alone is not the worst thing that can happen. Losing yourself is. And because you are no longer afraid of losing others, you actually love more freely. You allow people to be themselves. You accept that relationships change. You understand that connection is beautiful but impermanent. This understanding reduces jealousy, possessiveness, and insecurity. You are not constantly guarding the relationship because your identity does not depend on it. Solitude also deepens your empathy. When you have faced your own loneliness honestly, you recognize it in others. You see the hidden fears behind their behavior. You understand why someone might cling, withdraw, or react emotionally. Instead of judging them harshly, you respond with compassion. You know what it feels like to fear abandonment. You know what it feels like to crave validation, and that understanding softens your heart. At the same time, solitude strengthens your boundaries. Compassion does not mean self-sacrifice. Because you have learned to stand alone, you are no longer afraid to say no. You can walk away when respect is missing. You can choose peace over chaos. You can love someone and still refuse to accept harm. This balance between compassion and boundaries is a sign of spiritual maturity. The paradox is powerful. The more comfortable you become with being alone, the more capable you become of loving deeply. Not because you need someone, but because you want to share your fullness. Not because you fear silence, but because you appreciate connection. Solitude transforms love from dependency into choice. There is also a quiet confidence that develops when you know you can stand on your own. You no longer approach relationships with anxiety. You are not constantly scanning for signs of rejection. You are not overanalyzing every message. You are not losing sleep over uncertainty. You trust yourself, and that self-trust creates calm energy within your interactions. People can feel the difference. When someone is not clinging, not desperate, not seeking constant reassurance, their presence becomes peaceful. They become easier to love. They do not drain energy. They do not demand constant proof of loyalty. They simply show up as they are. This is the spiritual advantage of solitude. It refines your understanding of love. It teaches you that love is not possession, it is not dependency, it is not fear disguised as attachment. Love is presence without control. It is care without losing identity. It is connection without collapse. Alone hurts at first because it exposes how much you relied on others to feel secure. But as you remain in that space and grow stronger, you realize something profound. You were never meant to lose yourself in love. You were meant to stand firmly in your own being and then share that stability with others. When you reach this point, you no longer fear being alone. You no longer chase love as a solution to emptiness. You approach relationships with clarity. You give freely, but you do not beg. You care deeply, but you do not cling. You stay true to yourself, even while loving others. And that is true spiritual strength. Not isolation from the world, but connection without dependency. Not emotional coldness, but emotional balance. Not fear of losing, but peace in knowing that even if everything changes, you remain whole. Solitude teaches you this. It takes you through discomfort, through fear, through silence, until you discover the one thing that cannot be taken away: your own grounded presence. From that place, love becomes pure. From that place, relationships become healthier. From that place, you become spiritually free. Alone hurts, until it teaches you how to love without losing yourself. 12. Solitude reveals that your true home was always within. There is a deep longing inside every human being, a quiet search for safety, belonging, and peace. From childhood, you look for this feeling in places and people. You look for it in family, in friendships, in romantic love, in success, in recognition. You believe that somewhere outside of you there is a place where you will finally feel at home. A place where you can relax completely, where you are fully accepted, where you are no longer anxious or incomplete. This search shapes many of your decisions. It influences who you choose, what you tolerate, and what you chase. But what happens when you are alone and none of these external anchors are present? What happens when there is no one around to give you that sense of belonging? At first, solitude can feel like exile. It can feel like you have been removed from the place where safety exists. You may feel unsettled, almost like you are drifting without direction. The familiar comfort of others' presence is gone. The mind begins to whisper that you are disconnected, that you are separate, that you are alone in a vast world. Yet if you stay in solitude long enough without running from it, something extraordinary begins to unfold. You begin to discover that the feeling of home you were searching for outside was never truly located there. It was a feeling generated within you when you felt understood, accepted, or loved. And those feelings, though triggered by others, were experienced inside your own awareness. This realization changes everything. In Buddhism, the idea of refuge is central. Taking refuge does not mean hiding from the world. It means recognizing where true stability lies. The Buddha taught that external conditions are impermanent. People change, relationships shift, circumstances evolve. If your sense of home depends entirely on these changing conditions, then your peace will always be unstable. Solitude forces you to confront this truth directly. It removes temporary shelters so you can discover the permanent one within. When you sit alone and observe your thoughts, emotions, and fears without immediately trying to escape them, you begin to cultivate inner refuge. You begin to realize that even when uncomfortable emotions arise, there is a deeper awareness that holds them. Even when loneliness appears, there is a presence observing it. That observing presence is steady. It does not panic. It does not collapse. It simply witnesses. The more time you spend in solitude, the more familiar you become with this inner presence. You start to trust it. You begin to see that no matter what thoughts pass through your mind, there is something constant beneath them. No matter what emotions rise, there is something stable that notices them. This stability is not loud or dramatic. It is quiet. It is subtle, but it is powerful. Slowly, you stop searching outside for the feeling of being complete. You begin to create that feeling within. You learn how to sit peacefully in your own company. You learn how to comfort yourself when sadness arises. You learn how to encourage yourself when doubt appears. The relationship you build with yourself becomes deeper and more supportive than any external reassurance. This does not mean you no longer value connection. It means you no longer depend on it for survival. You begin to approach relationships as additions to your life, not as foundations of your identity. When someone leaves, it hurts, but it does not destroy you. When plans change, you adjust without losing your sense of direction. Your inner home remains intact. Solitude also teaches you to enjoy simple presence. Without constant external stimulation, you begin to appreciate small moments. The sound of your breathing, the feeling of sunlight on your skin, the quiet rhythm of your thoughts settling. These simple experiences reconnect you to being itself. You realize that peace is not something dramatic or extraordinary. It is the natural state that appears when craving and resistance fade. Over time, the fear of being alone dissolves. It dissolves because you no longer feel homeless within yourself. You no longer feel like you must attach to someone to feel safe. You no longer feel like your identity depends on being chosen. You stand comfortably in your own awareness. That awareness becomes your refuge. This transformation is profound. Many people spend their entire lives searching for home in unstable places. They move from relationship to relationship, from achievement to achievement, hoping that the next one will finally provide lasting security. But security built on impermanence cannot last. Solitude reveals this gently but clearly. It shows you that the only stable ground is the ground of your own awakened presence. When you discover this inner home, your relationship with the world changes. You engage fully, but you are not desperate. You care deeply, but you are not afraid of loss. You love openly, but you do not cling. You participate in life from a place of grounded calm rather than anxious searching. Alone hurts at first because it feels like being removed from safety. But as you remain in solitude and learn to rest in your own awareness, you realize that safety was never outside, it was always within. The silence that once frightened you becomes comforting. The emptiness that once felt unbearable becomes spacious and peaceful. Solitude reveals that your true home was never in another person's approval, never in constant company, never in external validation. Your true home is the quiet, steady awareness that remains when everything else falls away. And once you discover that home, you carry it with you everywhere. That is the ultimate spiritual advantage of being alone. It brings you back to yourself. It strips away illusions. It removes temporary shelters. And in doing so, it reveals the one refuge that cannot be taken away. Alone hurts, until you realize you were never homeless to begin with. 13. Solitude destroys the fear of abandonment. One of the deepest fears hidden inside the human heart is the fear of being abandoned. It may not always appear clearly, but it influences countless decisions. It shapes how tightly you hold on to people. It shapes how much you tolerate. It shapes how much you silence your own needs just to avoid being left. The fear of abandonment whispers quietly in the background of many relationships. It says, "If they leave, I will not survive. If they walk away, I will fall apart. If I am alone, I will be nothing." This fear is powerful because it attacks your sense of security. From childhood, safety was often linked to connection. When caregivers were present, you felt protected. When attention was withdrawn, you felt uncertain. Over time, the mind associated connection with survival. As an adult, even though you are physically capable of standing alone, emotionally you may still feel that being left equals danger. That is why rejection hurts so deeply. It does not just hurt your pride, it touches an old survival instinct. Solitude brings this fear to the surface. When you are alone, especially after loss or distance, the fear of abandonment may feel overwhelming. The mind begins to replay memories. It questions what went wrong. It blames itself. It imagines future loneliness. It may even try to rush back into unhealthy connections just to avoid the discomfort. At this stage, solitude feels like proof of your worst fear. It feels like confirmation that you have been left behind. But if you remain in solitude instead of escaping it, something transformative happens. You begin to experience something unexpected. You are still here. The world did not collapse. Your existence did not disappear. Your breath continues. Your awareness remains. The fear predicted destruction, but destruction did not occur. Each day you wake up and function, despite being alone, weakens the fear's authority. In Buddhism, suffering often arises from clinging and aversion. You cling to connection because you believe it is your only safety. You resist solitude because you believe it is your enemy. Solitude gives you the chance to question both assumptions. When you sit with the fear of abandonment without reacting, you start to observe its mechanics. You see how it creates catastrophic stories. You see how it exaggerates outcomes. You see how it confuses emotional discomfort with actual danger. Gradually, awareness reduces its intensity. You begin to separate feeling from reality. You may feel lonely, but loneliness is not fatal. You may feel rejected, but rejection does not erase your worth. You may feel unwanted, but that feeling does not define your entire existence. This clarity builds emotional strength. As days and weeks pass in conscious solitude, you develop self-trust. You learn that you can comfort yourself. You learn that you can endure silence. You learn that you can rebuild after loss. Each time you face a wave of loneliness and survive it, your confidence grows. You start to realize that the fear of abandonment was exaggerated by the mind. This does not mean the pain disappears instantly. It means the pain becomes manageable. It no longer controls your behavior. You no longer beg people to stay out of fear. You no longer shrink yourself to avoid being left. You no longer sacrifice your dignity just to maintain connection. Why? Because you have already faced your greatest fear, being alone. And you survived. Solitude also teaches you a deeper truth. People leaving does not equal you being unworthy. It simply reflects impermanence. In life, everything changes. Relationships shift. Paths diverge. Expectations evolve. When you understand impermanence deeply, you stop taking separation as personal failure. You see it as part of the natural flow of existence. The Buddha emphasized that attachment to permanence causes suffering. When you expect people to remain unchanged forever, you resist reality. Solitude allows you to sit with this truth calmly. It helps you accept that connection is beautiful but temporary. And when you accept this, fear loosens its grip. Over time, your relationship with abandonment transforms. Instead of fearing it constantly, you become neutral toward it. You know that if someone leaves, it will hurt, but it will not destroy you. You know that you have the capacity to rebuild. You know that your worth is not dependent on someone's decision to stay. This inner security changes how you relate to others. You stop approaching relationships from anxiety. You stop monitoring every interaction for signs of withdrawal. You stop overanalyzing silence. You stop trying to control outcomes. You allow connection to unfold naturally. If someone stays, you appreciate it. If someone leaves, you let them go with dignity. Paradoxically, this makes your relationships healthier. When you are not clinging out of fear, your presence feels lighter. You give people space. You respect their freedom. You are not suffocating them with insecurity. And because you are no longer desperate, you attract connections based on mutual respect rather than emotional dependency. The spiritual advantage of solitude here is profound. It transforms fear into freedom. It takes the most painful possibility, being left alone, and turns it into a source of empowerment. Once you realize that you can stand alone peacefully, no one holds emotional power over you. You are no longer manipulated by threats of withdrawal. You are no longer controlled by the anxiety of losing someone. Alone hurts at first because it forces you to confront the ancient fear of abandonment. But as you remain present, as you breathe through the discomfort, as you observe without reacting, the fear weakens. You begin to see that abandonment was never the end of you. It was simply a change in circumstance. And when you no longer fear being left, you become truly free. You love without panic. You connect without desperation. You live without constant anxiety about who might walk away. Your foundation is no longer external. It is internal. Solitude destroys the illusion that you cannot survive alone. It proves that your strength was always greater than your fear. And once that truth settles in your heart, you move through life with quiet confidence. Alone hurts until it removes the fear that once controlled you. 14. Solitude trains you to detach without becoming cold. One of the greatest misunderstandings about spiritual growth is the idea that detachment means becoming distant, emotionless, or indifferent. Many people fear that if they grow comfortable with being alone, they will stop caring. They worry that solitude will make them isolated, disconnected, or emotionally numb. But true detachment in Buddhism is not about shutting down the heart. It is about freeing the heart from unhealthy attachment. And solitude is the training ground where this delicate balance is learned. When you are constantly surrounded by others, emotions are easily amplified. You react quickly. You absorb moods. You feel pulled into drama. You may cling tightly when things feel good and panic when things feel uncertain. Without space, it becomes difficult to see clearly. You confuse intensity with love. You confuse dependency with connection. You may even mistake chaos for passion. Solitude creates distance between you and emotional noise. It slows everything down. Without constant interaction, your nervous system begins to settle. You have time to reflect instead of react. You begin to notice how much of your suffering came not from events themselves, but from your attachment to outcomes. You see how desperately you wanted things to go a certain way. You see how tightly you held on to people's responses, and you see how painful it was when reality did not match your expectations. The Buddha taught that attachment leads to suffering because it binds you to what is constantly changing. People change, feelings change, circumstances change. When you cling to them as if they are permanent, you create tension. Solitude reveals this truth gently but clearly. When you sit alone, you experience directly how thoughts arise and pass. You see how emotions peak and dissolve. You realize that nothing stays fixed. This realization becomes the foundation of healthy detachment. Healthy detachment does not mean you stop loving. It means you stop trying to control. It means you stop demanding permanence from impermanent things. It means you allow others to be who they are without forcing them to meet your emotional needs at every moment. Solitude gives you the inner stability required to do this. Because you have already faced loneliness and survived it, you are not terrified of letting go. At first, detachment can feel uncomfortable. When you stop clinging, you may feel vulnerable. You may feel like you are losing control. But as you practice sitting with uncertainty in solitude, you begin to see that control was always an illusion. You cannot force someone to stay. You cannot force emotions to remain constant. You cannot freeze life in a comfortable moment. The more you accept this, the calmer you become. Solitude also teaches you emotional regulation. Instead of immediately reacting to discomfort, you learn to pause. Instead of chasing reassurance, you learn to breathe through insecurity. Instead of demanding answers, you learn to tolerate uncertainty. This pause is powerful. It prevents impulsive decisions. It prevents unnecessary conflict. It prevents you from saying or doing things driven purely by fear. As this inner calm develops, your relationships become healthier. You no longer hold on to people out of desperation. You allow space within connection. You respect individuality. You do not suffocate others with constant need. And because you are not clinging, your presence feels lighter and more genuine. Detachment also protects your peace. When you are overly attached, every small shift feels like a threat. A delayed message becomes a sign of rejection. A disagreement becomes a sign of loss. Your mind creates stories that amplify suffering. But when you have cultivated detachment through solitude, you are less reactive. You understand that not every change is catastrophic. You understand that not every silence means abandonment. This understanding reduces unnecessary emotional storms. Importantly, healthy detachment does not make you cold. In fact, it often makes you more compassionate. When you are not consumed by your own fear of loss, you can be more present with others. You listen more fully. You support without expectation. You give without secretly demanding something in return. Your love becomes less transactional and more sincere. Solitude also strengthens your boundaries. When you are detached from the need to be constantly approved or needed, you are more willing to walk away from harmful situations. You do not tolerate disrespect simply to avoid being alone. You do not cling to relationships that drain you. You understand that your inner peace is valuable. Detachment gives you the courage to protect it. Over time, you realize that detachment is freedom. It frees you from the constant anxiety of losing what cannot be controlled. It frees you from obsessive thinking. It frees you from the exhausting cycle of clinging and fearing. You still care deeply, but your care is balanced. You still love fully, but your love does not erase you. This balance is subtle but powerful. You become someone who can connect deeply without collapsing into dependency. You can appreciate joy without fearing its end. You can experience loss without losing yourself. Solitude trains you in this balance because it forces you to find stability within rather than outside. Alone hurts at first because it removes the comfort of attachment. It exposes how much you relied on certain people or outcomes to feel safe. But as you remain in solitude and build inner strength, you discover that you can detach without becoming distant. You can let go without becoming empty. You can love without clinging. This is the spiritual advantage of solitude. It refines your heart. It makes your emotions steady instead of chaotic. It teaches you to flow with life rather than fight it. And in that flow, you find a peace that is not easily disturbed. Detachment is not the absence of love. It is the purification of love. And solitude is the quiet space where that purification happens. Being alone is not a curse. It is not proof that you are unwanted, unworthy, or forgotten. It is a sacred phase of transformation that most people try to escape too quickly. Solitude strips away illusions. It removes distractions. It exposes attachments, fears, insecurities, and dependencies that were quietly controlling your life. And yes, that exposure hurts. It feels uncomfortable. It feels empty, it feels heavy. But that discomfort is not destruction, it is purification. Through solitude, you learned that your happiness was not meant to be borrowed from others. You discovered that your mind can be observed instead of obeyed. You realized that emotional self-sufficiency is strength, not isolation. You saw your masks fall away and your true nature rise. You broke your addiction to validation. You transformed suffering into resilience. You destroyed the fear of abandonment. You learned to love without losing yourself. You built inner refuge. You became unshakable. The pain of being alone was never the enemy. Your resistance to it was. The moment you stopped running and started observing, the transformation began. Silence became insight. Emptiness became space. Loneliness became strength. What once felt like rejection became redirection. What once felt like absence became awakening. Buddhism teaches that suffering is not meant to be avoided blindly, but understood deeply. Solitude gives you the environment to understand it, and through understanding, freedom arises. Not freedom from life's challenges, but freedom from being controlled by them. When you can sit alone peacefully, the world no longer has the same power over you. You no longer beg for company just to escape yourself. You no longer tolerate disrespect just to avoid silence. You no longer collapse when someone leaves. You stand steady. You choose connection from fullness, not from fear. Alone hurts until it heals you. And once it heals you, you realize something extraordinary. You were never incomplete. You were never broken. You were simply untrained in your own depth. Solitude did not weaken you. It revealed your strength. It did not isolate you. It prepared you. Now, whether surrounded by people or sitting in silence, you carry the same grounded presence within you. And that presence, calm, aware, whole, is your greatest spiritual advantage.